I spent my life in the sky. Decades in uniform, with patches and medals, flying missions I can still see in my sleep. All those years I believed I was serving something greater, my country, the future, a cause worth every sacrifice. But one morning I woke up and realized I had no family, no home, no warm voice waiting for me behind a door. On paper, I was a hero. In my own life, I was no one. If you've ever put work above yourself, above your loved ones, if you've pushed forward without ever stopping to breathe, then maybe my story is also your story. Because I am one of thousands of women in America who gave everything and ended up with empty hands. My beginning was in the mid-1960s. America was a different place then. Bright Air Force posters on every street corner, smiling men in uniform in the newspapers, and no one could imagine a woman in the cockpit of a military aircraft. I was told more than once, this isn't for you, but I never learned how to accept other people's limits. My first day at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas smelled of cold metal, dust, and jet fuel. The tall hangars buzzed like beehives, mechanics shouting over the roar of engines, the dry wind cutting across my face. The men looked at me with curiosity, as if I were some strange bird that believed it could fly higher than them. Training was hell. Dawn runs and heavy boots through the morning mist, hours of drills, endless theory classes where every question felt like a test of whether I belonged there. I kept my mouth shut, clenched my teeth, and learned. I remember my first flight down to the second. The engines roar, the cold air in the cockpit, the horizon stretching into forever. Up there were no doubts, no fatigue, just me and the machine. I came back to Earth after decades of service, but when the wheels touched the ground for the last time, I knew something inside me had died with that landing. The 1960s rolled into the 70s, and I was still in the air. While most women my age were decorating nurseries or planning backyard barbecues, I was landing jets on desert airstrips in Nevada, skimming the California coastline on training runs, and threading between the snow-capped peaks of Colorado. The world looked different from up there. Bigger, lonelier, and somehow more honest. Every mission had its rhythm. The checklist, the engine's rising growl, the sharp snap of the harness, the weightless moment just before the wheels left the ground. There's a silence in flight that's impossible to explain to someone who's never been there. It's not the absence of sound, it's the absence of everything except the truth that you are exactly where you're meant to be. Men came and went. Some tried to get close. A fellow officer in Arizona once brought me coffee every morning for 6 weeks until I turned down his third proposal for dinner. Another, a mechanic in California, told me I was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, especially in a flight suit. I never knew whether to take that as a compliment or a challenge. In the end, I kept my heart as guarded as the aircraft I flew. Letters from home were brief. My mother's handwriting grew shakier over the years. Friends wrote less and less, busy with their own lives, their own children. Sometimes I'd catch myself looking at the photos they send, birthday parties, first days of school, Christmas trees, and feeling a sharp pang in my chest. Not regret, not exactly. More like the faint echo of a life I'd never chosen, and now never could. The Air Force became my family, my calendar, my compass. I measured time not in birthdays or anniversaries, but in missions, deployments, and aircraft maintenance schedules. And as the years stacked up, I began to wonder, when the day came to take off the uniform for good, who would I be without it? My last flight wasn't supposed to feel different, but it did. The orders were simple: a routine training mission over the Pacific, then back to base. I'd flown the same route dozens of times before, but that morning, the sky seemed sharper, the air thinner, the hum of the engines almost fragile. We took off from Travis Air Force Base in California just as the first streaks of sunlight cut across the hangars. The ocean opened up beneath me, a vast sheet of silver and blue stretching beyond the horizon. I could see the curve of the earth, the edge where day met night. I'd always loved that line, the place where tomorrow begins. Halfway through the flight, it hit me. This was the last time I'd hear this sound from inside a cockpit. The last time I'd watch the altimeter climb. The last time the world below would shrink into a patchwork of colors and shapes. For decades, this view had been my whole life, and now it was slipping away. When we landed, the crew greeted me like it was any other mission. A nod here, a quick good job there. No ceremony, no speeches, just the quiet hiss of the cooling engines and the faint smell of fuel in the air. I walked across the tarmac, my boots clicking on the concrete, and handed over my helmet. That was it. The next morning, I woke up in my apartment to a silence so heavy it felt physical. No briefing, no uniform to put on, no reason to check the weather. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the blank wall, and felt the weight of every choice I'd made pressing in on me. People think retirement is freedom, but freedom isn't the absence of orders. It's knowing where you belong when there's no one telling you. And I didn't belong anywhere anymore. The first week out felt like stepping into a foreign country, except it was my own hometown. I'd moved into a small apartment just outside Dayton, Ohio, not far from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I thought being close to the sound of engines might make the transition easier. It didn't. The days stretched long. In the Air Force, every hour had a purpose. Here, time just leaked away. I tried to fill it. Grocery shopping, cleaning, short walks around the neighborhood. But everything felt muted, like I was watching life through thick glass. Neighbors would wave politely. A retired couple across the hall invited me for coffee once. They asked the usual questions. What did you do before? Do you have kids? My answers were short, careful. Most people don't know what to say when you tell them you flew for the military. They smile, they say thank you for your service, and then the silence hangs between you, heavy and awkward. At night, I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing echoes of radio chatter in my head. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I'd dream I was back in the cockpit, the soft vibration of the controls in my hands, the endless stretch of sky ahead. I'd wake up with my heart pounding, only to find myself in the same quiet room, the same still air. I kept a small box of mementos on the shelf. Patches, old flight logs, a photo of my first crew standing in front of a C-141 Starlifter. I'd take it down some evenings, run my fingers over the worn fabric, and feel a mix of pride and something else. Loss, maybe. Not for the job itself, but for the version of me that only existed up there in the air. And beneath it all was the question I didn't want to face. If the Air Force had been my whole identity, who was I now? I told myself I would start fresh. That's what everyone says, isn't it? A new chapter, a second act. But no one tells you how to write it when all the pages before were filled with someone else's rules, someone else's clock. I tried to follow the advice people give retirees. Join a club, take a class, volunteer. I signed up for a local photography group. On the first night, they met in the back room of a library. Everyone was friendly, smiling, chatting about lenses and shutter speeds. I smiled back, listened, but inside I felt like a ghost. They spoke a language I didn't know, the language of lives built around families, hobbies, vacations. My life had been built around missions, protocols, and survival. I went to a veterans group at the community center. There were men there from Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. They talked about their tours, the brothers they'd lost, the transition back home. Some of it I understood. But when I spoke about being a woman in the Air Force in the 1960s, most of them just looked puzzled, as if my war had been a different kind entirely. The truth was, I didn't know where I fit. Not in the civilian world, not fully in the veterans one either. And that's when the loneliness started to seep in. Not the kind that comes from being physically alone, but the kind that comes from feeling like your entire life was lived on a frequency no one else can hear. I'd walk past a playground and see a mother laughing with her child. I'd pass a cafe and watch two friends leaning across a table sharing secrets, and I'd feel this ache. Not for those exact moments, but for the simple fact that they belonged somewhere, to someone. In the Air Force, I knew exactly who I was. Out here, I was just another face in a crowd. And I realized that's the part no one prepares you for.
Some days I would drive with no destination, just to hear the tires hum against the road. I'd find myself heading toward places I'd been stationed, as if muscle memory was stronger than my own will. Once, I drove all the way back to Lackland in Texas, the base where it all started. I couldn't get past the gates without clearance, of course, but I sat in my car outside for nearly an hour, watching the young recruits march in formation. Their boots struck the pavement in perfect unison, their faces sharp with determination. I wondered which of them would still be standing there in 20 years, and what it might cost them. Another time, I went to Nevada, to a little airstrip outside Reno where I'd done countless desert training flights. The hangars were smaller than I remembered, the mountains a little less imposing. I stood on the edge of the runway, feeling the dry wind against my face, and for a moment, I could almost hear the roar of the engines. Almost. California was harder. The coastline there had been my favorite route. Endless blue, the horizon melting into the sea. I drove to a cliff near Monterey where I used to watch the sunset after long days in the air. The same sun was setting, the same waves were breaking, but without the flight before it, the view felt incomplete. Everywhere I went, the past was waiting, stitched into the landscape. But the past doesn't hold you. It doesn't wrap you in warmth or keep the loneliness out at night. It just stands there, silent, like an old photograph you can't step back into. And somewhere between those trips, I realized I had spent my life moving from base to base, mission to mission, never staying long enough to grow roots. I thought I had a home in the Air Force, but the truth was, I'd only ever had assignments.
I tried to build what people call a normal life. I bought curtains for the apartment, a proper set of dishes, even a small dining table with 4 chairs, though I couldn't imagine who might fill them. I went to the farmer's market on Saturdays, picked out fresh bread and fruit, and tried to pretend these were the kinds of errands I'd always done. But the truth was, I didn't know how to live without a mission. Every task felt hollow. I'd clean the kitchen and think, what's the point? No inspection coming. I'd cook dinner and end up eating it in silence, my fork scraping the plate in a room too quiet. Friends from the service would call now and then. Most were scattered across the country, Arizona, Florida, Alaska. We'd talk about old times, swap stories about bases and aircraft. but the calls always ended the same way. A pause, a sigh, and well, take care of yourself. The kind of goodbye that carries the weight of distance you can't close. I went on a few dates. Men who'd read about my service in the local paper seemed impressed at first. They'd ask about flying, about the planes, about what it was like. But sooner or later, they'd lean in and say, "You must have been so lonely back then." I never knew how to explain that the real loneliness started after I took off the uniform. Even in a crowded cafe, I felt like I was standing apart, watching life happen to other people. They had inside jokes, shared histories, the comfort of someone who would notice if they didn't come home that night. I had stories, memories from a life that didn't exist anymore. And maybe that's the part no one understands, that when you've lived for something bigger than yourself, coming back to just yourself can feel like a kind of exile. It happened one quiet evening. I was sitting on the couch with a book I'd been pretending to read for weeks. The TV was off, the street outside almost silent, except for the hum of a passing car now and then. I caught my reflection in the darkened window, the curve of my shoulders, the lines on my face, the way my hands rested still in my lap. And it hit me. I wasn't building a new life. I was staging one. Every plant I bought, every dinner I cooked, every polite smile I gave at the grocery store, it was all part of a performance I didn't believe in. In the Air Force, even the smallest action had meaning. Checking a gauge, tightening a strap, logging a flight hour, all of it connected to a purpose, a bigger picture. Here, everything felt disconnected, floating. I was moving through the motions of living without the anchor of belonging. I thought about all the women I'd met over the years, nurses, teachers, factory workers, mothers, who'd given everything to their jobs, their families, their duties, and then one day found themselves alone in a kitchen or a quiet house, wondering when they'd stopped being a person and started being just a role. I realized I wasn't unique. My uniform had been different, my missions more dramatic, but the end result was the same as theirs. A life that looked full from the outside, but felt empty inside. And the worst part? No one talks about it. We celebrate the service, the dedication, the sacrifice, but we don't talk about what's left when the service ends. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. I just sat there, staring at my own reflection, and admitted the thing I'd been avoiding. I didn't know who I was without the work, and I'd never bothered to find out.
The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, the way I always had during my years in service. But instead of making coffee and settling into the same small routine, I pulled out a map, a real paper map, creased, worn at the folds. I spread it across the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. In the Air Force, every mission started with a flight plan. Where you take off, where you land, what you'll see in between. I didn't have a plane anymore, but I thought maybe I could make a plan for myself. I circled places I'd never been. Little towns in Montana, the Red Rock Canyons of Utah, the empty plains of Kansas. Not because they were famous or exciting, but because they were unfamiliar. I wanted to know what it felt like to arrive somewhere without orders, without a schedule, without a reason other than wanting to be there. By mid-morning, I packed a small suitcase. Just clothes, a notebook, and an old camera I'd bought at a thrift store. No dress uniforms, no flight manuals, no souvenirs of the life I'd been clinging to. I locked the apartment door behind me and didn't leave a note. There was no one to read it. Driving east out of Dayton, the sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky in gold and pale pink. I rolled down the window and felt the cold air sting my face. For the first time in years, I wasn't heading toward a base, a meeting, or a mission. I was just heading out. somewhere along that stretch of road, I realized this wasn't about escaping the loneliness. It was about meeting it face to face, somewhere far from the echo of everything I used to be. The first stop was a small town in Indiana, the kind you miss if you blink at the wrong time. A single gas station, a diner with peeling paint, and a row of houses that looked the same as they must have 50 years ago. I stayed at a roadside motel, the kind with doors that open directly onto the parking lot and a faint smell of cigarette smoke that never leaves the curtains. In the morning, I walked to the diner. The waitress was maybe in her 20s, hair tied back, moving fast between tables. She smiled like she knew everyone, and maybe she did. When she poured my coffee, she asked if I was just passing through. I nodded. She didn't ask for more, just topped off the cup and left me alone. From my corner booth, I watched the town wake up. Two older men in baseball caps arguing about last night's game, a mother trying to keep her toddler from spilling orange juice, a teenage couple sitting too close in a back booth whispering and laughing like they were the only people in the world. It wasn't extraordinary, it wasn't cinematic, but there was something grounding about it. The smallness of the moments, the way people fit into each other's lives like pieces of a puzzle. I realized I had spent decades flying over places like this, seeing them as dots on a map, names on a mission log. But down here, at eye level, they were full of lives I'd never known, stories I'd never heard. And maybe that was the point. That night, back in the motel, I wrote in my notebook, not every mission has to be big to matter. Sometimes it's enough just to land somewhere and stay long enough to see it. I didn't know where I'd go next, but for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It felt alive.
A few days later, I crossed into Illinois and found myself in a town that sat on the edge of endless farmland. The streets were lined with bare trees, their branches like veins against the winter sky. I stopped at a small antique store, drawn in by the faint smell of old wood and books. Inside, a woman about my age was arranging glassware on a shelf. She had silver hair pulled into a loose braid, and she greeted me like we'd met before. We talked for a while about the weather, about how the winters here felt longer than they used to. At some point, she asked if I lived nearby. No, I said. I'm just traveling. Her smile shifted, softer now. She said, "Good. Everyone should see the world at least once without being told where to go." I left the store with a small brass compass I didn't need but couldn't resist. That sentence of hers followed me for miles, without being told where to go. It was such a simple thing, and yet it felt like something I'd never really done. That night, I stayed in a bed and breakfast run by another woman in her 60s. Over tea in her kitchen, she told me about her husband who'd passed, about raising 3 kids on her own, about how she'd never taken a vacation until she was 50. She spoke plainly, without self-pity, but I could feel the weight of years spent putting herself last. Listening to her, I saw pieces of myself in her words. Different lives, different choices, but the same thread. The kind that ties you to duty so tightly, you forget where you end and the duty begins. Lying in bed later, I thought about how many women across America were sitting in kitchens just like hers, staring into the quiet, wondering if it was too late to start over. I kept driving west, letting the roads choose for me. Somewhere in Missouri, I pulled off at a rest stop just before sunset. A wide stretch of land opened beyond it, flat fields touched with gold from the fading light. The air smelled of dry grass and distant wood smoke. There was an older man sitting on a bench, wearing a worn denim jacket and holding a paper cup of coffee. He nodded as I sat down a few feet away. For a while, we just watched the sky deepen into shades of orange and purple. Then he said, "Beautiful, isn't it? But it's gone in minutes."
Something in the way he said it made me ask where he was headed. He shrugged. Nowhere in particular. Been on the road for months. Guess I'm chasing things before they disappear. We didn't exchange names. We didn't need to. We just sat until the stars began to show. Two strangers sharing the same quiet. When I finally stood to leave, he looked at me and said, "Don't wait too long to live your life." The next day, I ended up in a small town with a single main street and a faded mural of a B-17 bomber on the side of the post office. The image stopped me in my tracks. I stood there for a long time, tracing the painted lines of the wings with my eyes, remembering the first time I touched the metal of a real aircraft. It struck me then how much of my life had been spent looking up at the sky, at missions, at goals always ahead of me. And maybe now, for the first time, I needed to look around. That evening, I wrote in my notebook, "Life on the ground isn't lesser. It's just different terrain." Listening to her, I saw pieces of myself in her words. Different lives, different choices, but the same thread. The kind that ties you to duty so tightly you forget where you end and the duty begins. Lying in bed later, I thought about how many women across America were sitting in kitchens just like hers, staring into the quiet, wondering if it was too late to start over.
In Kansas, I stopped at a small roadside cafe that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. The kind where the stools at the counter still spin and the menu is painted on a wooden board above the grill. I sat at the counter, ordered black coffee, and listened to the conversations around me. Two women in their 70s were sitting a few stools down, talking in low voices. I caught bits and pieces. One of them was describing how she'd sold the farm after her husband passed, how she'd moved into town, but still woke up every morning at 5 out of habit. I don't know why, but I turned to them and said, "I used to wake up early too, couldn't stop, even after I left my work." One of them smiled knowingly. "Some things don't leave you," she said, "even when they're gone." We talked for almost an hour about routines, about losing people, about the strange emptiness that comes after decades of doing what you were supposed to do. They weren't pilots, they hadn't served in the military, but their words felt like they were written for me. When I left, one of the women touched my arm and said, "You know, you're not alone in that feeling. There are more of us out here than you think." Her words followed me back to the car, settling into me like a truth I'd been avoiding. It wasn't just my story. It was a story shared by millions of women. Women who had worked, served, cared, given, and then found themselves with nothing but the echo of all that effort. That night, in the quiet of another roadside motel, I thought about how different our lives had been and how identical our endings felt. And I began to wonder if maybe the healing didn't come from starting over, but from finally finding each other. A week later, I found myself in Oklahoma in a library so small it could have fit inside the hangar of my old base. I only meant to use the restroom and stretch my legs, but I wandered into a corner where a local history group was meeting. There were 6 women, all over 50, seated around the long table with coffee cups and stacks of old photographs. They were sorting through pictures for a town archive, school plays, parades, county fairs from decades past. I lingered nearby, pretending to browse the shelves, but listening. They spoke about neighbors who had moved away, about stores that had closed, about how the town had been shrinking for years. But underneath their words, I heard something else. A quiet resilience, a kind of pride in having stayed, in remembering what once was. One of them noticed me and asked if I wanted to join. I hesitated, then sat down. We spent an hour passing around photographs, each image sparking another story. I didn't have any memories of this place, but somehow their voices made me feel like I belonged there in that moment. When the meeting ended, a woman with short gray hair and a voice like warm gravel said, It's good to have someone listen. Most people are too busy moving on. Driving away, I thought about how much of my life had been spent in motion, planes, transfers, relocations, always moving on. Maybe that was why staying, even for an hour, felt so strange and so comforting. That night in my notebook, I wrote, maybe connection isn't about shared history. Maybe it's just about staying still long enough to hear someone's story. A few days later, I was in a small Texas town, staying at a family-run inn above a diner. In the evenings, the guests would gather in the common room, a space with mismatched furniture, a big fireplace, and a shelf of board games no one touched. That night, it was just me and an older woman named Ruth. She was knitting, her needles clicking softly, the sound almost like the ticking of a clock. After a while, she asked where I was from, and instead of giving my usual vague answer, I told her I'd spent decades in the Air Force. Her hand stilled, the yarn resting in her lap. That must have been something, she said. Flying like that? And before I knew it, I was telling her everything. The first time I soloed a plane, the rush of takeoff, the long nights in the barracks, the sound of the engines that still lived in my bones. I told her about the pride and the purpose, but also the weight. The way coming home didn't feel like home anymore. Ruth didn't interrupt. She didn't tell me I was lucky or brave. She just listened. Really listened, like each word was worth holding on to. When I finally stopped, she said, "You know, not many people can talk about what they've lost without making it a tragedy. You're not telling me about loss, you're telling me about living." Her words stayed with me long after she went upstairs. It occurred to me that maybe my story wasn't just mine to carry. Maybe there was a reason I kept crossing paths with women like her, women who had lived their own versions of service, sacrifice, and quiet endurance. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "Every time I tell it, the story belongs a little more to the world and a little less to me." The next morning, I lingered over breakfast in the diner below the inn. Ruth was already gone, but her words were still echoing in my head. I realized something. In all my years of service, I'd logged every mission, every flight hour, every mechanical detail, but I never logged the people. Not really. That thought stayed with me as I drove south along quiet highways lined with bare cotton fields. By noon, I pulled into a town so small, it didn't have a stoplight. There was only a church, a post office, and a general store with a faded Coca-Cola sign. Inside the store, 2 women were sitting behind the counter, sorting mail and chatting about a local boy joining the Navy. I bought a bottle of water and, almost without thinking, asked them what it was like to watch so many young people leave. They looked at each other, then at me, and one of them said, "You get used to it, but you never stop wondering who they'll be when they come back." That was it, the whole exchange. But it hit me harder than I expected. That single sentence carried decades of waiting, of hoping, of silent resilience. I stepped outside and sat on the bench in front of the store. The winter sun was warm on my face, and I opened my notebook. I wrote down their words exactly as they'd been spoken. Then I added the date, the name of the town, and a short description of the 2 women. It felt almost like flying again, the sense that I was capturing something fleeting before it was gone. As I closed my notebook, I decided, wherever I went next, I'd keep doing this. Not just passing through, but stopping, asking, listening, leaving with more than just the memory of the road. In Louisiana, I stopped in a riverside town where the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pecan trees. The main street was lined with old brick buildings, some with boarded up windows, others turned into antique shops and cafes. I found a small bakery and went inside for coffee. The woman behind the counter was in her late 50s, with flour dusting her apron and fine lines etched deep around her eyes. I asked how long she'd been running the place. "Since my husband left," she said matter-of-factly, sliding a pastry into a paper bag. "That was 22 years ago. This shop became my life." She told me about waking up before dawn every day, about raising her 2 kids alone, about watching them move to cities far away. As she spoke, her hands kept moving, kneading dough, wiping counters, refilling sugar jars, like stillness was something she couldn't afford. I wrote her words in my notebook as soon as I sat down, not just the facts, but the rhythm of her voice, the way she glanced out the window between sentences as if measuring the years. When I left, she handed me the pastry without charging me. "For the road," she said, "and for listening." Driving out of town, I thought about how many women across this country carry entire lives in quiet, uncelebrated ways, building, holding, keeping things alive because no one else will. It wasn't the kind of service you get medals for, but it was service all the same. That night, I flipped back through the notebook, dozens of pages now, names, towns, fragments of voices. I realized I wasn't just collecting stories. I was collecting proof. Proof that we were here, that we mattered, even if the world never thought to ask. In Mississippi, I stayed at a roadside inn where the walls were thin enough to hear every car pass on the highway. It wasn't much, but it had a small porch that looked out over a field of tall, swaying grass. I sat there at dusk, the sky turning shades of pink and violet, flipping through my notebook. Each page held a piece of someone else's life. The bakery owner in Louisiana, the women in the Kansas cafe, the 2 mail sorters in the tiny Texas town, and Ruth with her knitting needles and steady eyes. Somewhere between those pages, I noticed something. Heaviness I'd carried for years. That dull, constant weight in my chest wasn't gone, but it had shifted. It was no longer just mine. These women's stories had braided themselves into my own, and somehow that made it easier to bear. The next morning, I walked into town and found a little diner, the kind with faded photographs of local fishing tournaments on the walls. The waitress was a young woman with tired eyes and a smile she wore like armor. When I asked how her day was going, she laughed, not the happy kind. "It's fine, just one of those mornings where you already feel behind." I told her I understood. I didn't try to fix it, didn't offer advice. I just let her talk. She told me about working 2 jobs, about caring for her sick grandmother, about feeling like she was treading water with no shore in sight. I wrote down her words in the notebook later, sitting on the porch again. And I realized something. Every time I listened, I wasn't just taking a story. I was giving something back. Space, attention, proof that someone saw them. For years, I believed my worth came from the missions I completed. Now, I was starting to think it came from the moments I stayed still. By the time I reached Alabama, I wasn't just drifting anymore. I was hunting, not for places, but for people. Every small town I passed through, I slowed down. I looked for the coffee shops that weren't chains, the community bulletin boards with curling flyers, the park benches where someone might be sitting alone. In a town outside Montgomery, I found a laundromat with a single row of humming machines and a cracked vending machine in the corner. A woman in her 70s sat in a plastic chair, folding towels into neat, perfect squares. She wore a faded floral dress and white sneakers that had seen better days. We talked while her clothes tumbled in the dryer. She told me she'd worked at the same textile mill for 40 years until it shut down. She didn't complain about it. She just said it like it was a fact, the way you talk about the weather. When I asked if she missed it, she paused, folding one last towel before answering. I miss knowing exactly where I belonged. I wrote that down the second I got back to my car. That sentence alone felt like a mirror. I'd been chasing that same feeling of belonging, of certainty, for years without realizing it. Later that day, I stopped at a gas station and overheard two teenage girls talking about how they couldn't wait to get out of this town. I wanted to tell them to hold on to it for just a little while longer, because one day they might miss the very streets they were desperate to leave. But I didn't. Some lessons you have to learn on your own. That night, lying in another motel bed, I understood something. My journey had started as a way to fill the emptiness, but now it was becoming something bigger. A living record of women's lives stitched together like a quilt across the country.
By the time I reached Alabama, I wasn't just drifting anymore. I was hunting, not for places, but for people. Every small town I passed through, I slowed down. I looked for the coffee shops that weren't chains, the community bulletin boards with curling flyers, the park benches where someone might be sitting alone. In a town outside Montgomery, I found a laundromat with a single row of humming machines and a cracked vending machine in the corner. A woman in her 70s sat in a plastic chair, folding towels into neat, perfect squares. She wore a faded floral dress and white sneakers that had seen better days. We talked while her clothes tumbled in the dryer. She told me she'd worked at the same textile mill for 40 years until it shut down. She didn't complain about it. She just said it like it was a fact, the way you'd talk about the weather. When I asked if she missed it, she paused, folding one last towel before answering. I miss knowing exactly where I belonged. I wrote that down the second I got back to my car. That sentence alone felt like a mirror. I'd been chasing that same feeling of belonging, of certainty for years without realizing it. Later that day, I stopped at a gas station and overheard two teenage girls talking about how they couldn't wait to get out of this town. I wanted to tell them to hold on to it for just a little while longer, because one day they might miss the very streets they were desperate to leave. But I didn't. Some lessons you have to learn on your own. That night, lying in another motel room, I understood something. My journey had started as a way to fill the emptiness, but now it was becoming something bigger, a living record of women's lives stitched together like a quilt across the country. In Georgia, I stopped in a town where the train tracks cut straight through the middle, the sound of passing freight cars echoing like distant thunder. I wandered into a dusty thrift store, more out of curiosity than anything else. Near the back, behind a rack of old leather jackets, I saw her, a young woman in her early 20s, trying on a faded bomber jacket. She turned toward the mirror, adjusting the collar, and for a moment, I swear I saw my younger self staring back. I couldn't help myself. I said, "That jacket looks like it has a few stories in it." She laughed softly. "I hope so. I'm leaving for the Air Force next month. Figured I should look the part." The air seemed to shift around me. I asked where she was from, what she hoped to do, and she told me everything. The excitement, the nerves, the desire to get out and see the world. Every word felt like an echo from decades ago. I didn't tell her about the loneliness, the years that would slip by faster than she could count, or the way the life she imagined might not be the one she got. Instead, I told her to keep a journal. I said, write it all down, every takeoff, every landing, every face you meet. One day, you'll be glad you did. She nodded, smiling like she had just been handed a secret. When I left the store, I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the tracks as another train rolled through. I realized I wasn't sad for her. I was proud that another young woman would take to the skies, carry that weight, and maybe, just maybe, learn sooner than I did that the ground holds its own kind of meaning. That night I wrote, "Sometimes the past doesn't come back to haunt you. Sometimes it comes back to shake your hand." 2 days later, I crossed into South Carolina,
following back roads that twisted through pine forests and sleepy towns. I stopped at a roadside produce stand where the peaches were stacked in wooden crates and the air smelled like summer, even in the middle of March. The woman running the stand was in her late 40s, her hair pulled back in a messy braid. She poured me a cup of sweet tea and asked where I was headed. When I told her I didn't really know, she grinned. Best way to travel. We ended up sitting on a bench beside the stand, watching the cars pass by on the 2-lane road. She told me she'd once planned to leave, join the Navy, see the world, but her father got sick and she stayed to take over the family farm. One choice, she said, and the whole map changes. Her voice wasn't bitter, but it carried a weight I recognized, the weight of wondering about the life that could have been. I thought about the young woman in Georgia trying on that bomber jacket and realized something. I'd been given a strange kind of gift. I could see the full arc, the hopes at the beginning, the realities in the middle, the quiet reckonings at the end. When I left the stand, the woman handed me a peach, its skin warm from the sun. She said, "For the road." The same words the bakery owner had used back in Louisiana. Driving away, I took a bite, the juice running down my hand, and felt the sweetness linger long after the fruit was gone. Some moments I realize aren't about what you take with you. They're about the taste that stays behind. That night I wrote, "Stories are like this. You don't carry them whole. You carry the parts that stay sweet, even after the moment has passed." In North Carolina, I rented a small cabin near a lake. The water was still in the mornings, like glass, reflecting the bare trees that ringed the shore. I spent hours sitting on the porch with my notebook, rereading what I had gathered so far. Something struck me as I flipped through the pages. These women's voices were starting to braid together in my mind, like threads in a single fabric. But in between their words, I could see the outline of my own life clearer than I ever had before. For years, I had thought of my story as a straight line. A young woman joins the Air Force, serves for decades, retires, and fades quietly into civilian life. But now, I could see it was never a line. It was a web connected to countless others, women who had chosen duty or sacrifice or simply stayed when they could have gone. One evening, as the sun dropped low over the lake, I walked down to the dock. A couple of kids were fishing at the far end, their laughter carrying over the water. I stood there for a long time, watching them, and thought about how no one plans to become a story. You just live, and somewhere along the way, the moments start adding up. That night, I called an old friend from my service days, another pilot, retired now, in Arizona. We hadn't spoken in years. We talked for over an hour, not about missions or medals, but about the quiet days in between, the people we met, the ones we lost touch with. After we hung up, I wrote in my notebook, maybe the real service isn't in what we did then, but in keeping the memories alive now. A week later, I found myself driving along the Blue Ridge Parkway, the mountains rolling out in soft blues and grays beneath a wide, cloud-streaked sky. The road curved endlessly, each bend revealing another view that made me slow down, sometimes pull over, just to take it in. At one overlook, I met a woman traveling alone in a beat-up camper van. Her name was Leela, and she'd been on the road for nearly 3 years. She brewed coffee on a small propane stove and offered me a cup without asking who I was or where I'd come from. We sat on the tailgate of her van, steam curling up from our mugs. She told me she'd once been a nurse in Florida, working 60-hour weeks, raising 2 boys, caring for her aging mother. One day, she said, I realized I'd spent my whole life taking care of everyone else, and I didn't even know who I was anymore. So she sold her house, bought the van, and started driving. I'm not running away, she added. I'm just making sure the rest of my life belongs to me. Her words hit me like the sudden drop after a long climb.
Because in all my years of service, I'd never asked myself who I was outside the uniform. And when the uniform was gone, I didn't have an answer. Before we parted, Leela handed me a slip of paper with the quote written in neat handwriting. "It's never too late to become the person you were meant to be." She told me she writes it down for everyone she meets on the road. Driving away, I kept glancing at that paper on the passenger seat. By the time I reached my next stop, I knew it wasn't enough to keep these stories in my notebook. They needed to be heard, not just for me, but for every woman who might recognize herself in them. That night, I wrote, "The sky's too wide for silence." I stopped in a small Virginia town where the local library doubled as a community center. A handwritten flyer on the bulletin board caught my eye. "Story night. Bring a tale, true or imagined." It was scheduled for that evening. I hadn't planned on staying long, but something in me wanted to see it. That night, I walked into the library's modest meeting room. About 20 people sat in a loose circle of folding chairs. A young woman with a kind smile welcomed me, handed me a cup of tea, and explained that anyone could stand up and tell a story. I intended to listen quietly, but after a few people spoke, a fisherman recalling a storm, a high school teacher sharing a funny moment from class, my heart started to pound. My hands felt restless like they used to before takeoff. When they asked if anyone else wanted to share, I heard my own voice say, "I do." I stood up, not with a polished speech, but with the memory of the women in Louisiana's bakery. I told them about her hands dusted with flour, her life measured in loaves of bread and quiet resilience. I didn't embellish, I didn't dramatize. I just told it the way it was. When I finished, the room was still for a moment. Then people began to nod, murmur, smile. Not polite smiles, but the kind that say, "I know exactly what you mean." Afterward, 3 women approached me. One said her mother had run a diner for 30 years. Another had spent decades in a textile mill. The third simply hugged me. Walking back to my car under the yellow glow of the street lamps, I realized something. Telling these stories out loud didn't just honor the women who lived them. It stitched me into the same fabric. That night, in my notebook, I wrote, "Connection isn't built from the sky down. It grows from the ground up." The next morning, I sat in a diner on the edge of town, the kind with cracked red vinyl booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. My notebook was open, but instead of writing, I kept thinking about the way the room had gone quiet after I told that story in the library. It was a silence that didn't feel empty. It felt full, like something important had just been set down between us. I ordered coffee and eggs, and while I waited, I sketched out an idea. What if I recorded these women's voices? Not polished interviews, just raw conversations. The way they really spoke, with pauses and laughter and the occasional long silence. I imagined threading those voices together, like the way the air traffic controllers used to weave all our flight paths into one big picture. A waitress in her 40s stopped by with my plate, glanced at the notebook, and asked if I was a writer. I almost said no. Then I realized maybe I was becoming one. "Something like that," I told her. She smiled and said, "If you need stories, you should talk to the ladies at the quilting group that meets here on Thursdays. They've seen it all." I wrote it down because maybe this was how it would work. One story leading me to the next, like stepping stones across a river. When I got back on the road, the idea kept growing. I could stop in community centers, churches, farmers markets. I could ask one question. What's the moment that shaped you most? And then just listen. By the time the sun dipped low behind the Blue Ridge, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not just purpose, but direction. Like a mission. But this time, no orders, no commanders. Just me, the open road, and the stories waiting to be found. That night I wrote, "The sky was my first map. Now
I'm learning the map of voices.
I bought a small handheld recorder in a hardware store that sold everything from fishing lures to kitchen aprons. It fit in my jacket pocket, light enough to forget it was there. The first time I used it was in a church basement in West Virginia. The quilting group the waitress had mentioned was gathered around a long table, scraps of fabric piled high, the hum of conversation mixing with the steady sound of scissors and needles. I asked if I could sit and listen. They welcomed me like an old friend, pushing a chair into the circle. At first they talked about fabric, patterns, colors, mistakes turned into creative solutions. But then, slowly, the stories began to come. One woman, Mary, told me about her husband working in the coal mines for 35 years and how after he passed, she didn't know what to do with herself until she started quilting again. It's not just cloth, she said, running her fingers over a patchwork square. It's a way of keeping my hands busy so my heart doesn't break. I clicked the recorder on without making a fuss. Her voice was low and steady, but there were places where it trembled just enough to let the truth through. When I played it back that night in my motel room, I heard more than her words. I heard the pauses, the breaths she took before saying past, the soft laughter when another woman teased her for her crooked stitches. Those were the details no notebook could ever hold the same way. Lying in bed, I thought about all the voices I'd never recorded in my life. My mother's when she was telling me to be careful, my fellow pilots trading stories over coffee in the mess hall, the woman I used to be, speaking only to herself in the quiet. I wrote, "Some truths aren't meant to be written, they're meant to be heard."
A few days later, I drove north into Pennsylvania and stopped in a small town where the main street still had brick sidewalks and a single blinking traffic light. A snowstorm had dusted everything in white the night before, and the air smelled sharp and clean. At a corner cafe, I met a woman named Ruth. She was in her late 60s, sitting alone by the window, knitting something the color of autumn leaves. I asked if I could join her, and she nodded without looking up from her work. Over coffee, she told me she'd been a nurse during the Vietnam War, stationed stateside, but watching young men come in broken and leave even more so. She'd married one of them, thinking love could heal what war had done. Her hands kept moving with the knitting needles as she spoke. 40 years, she said quietly. 40 years of trying to hold him together only to realize I'd unraveled myself. The words landed in my chest like a slow, heavy drop. I pressed the record button without breaking eye contact. Her voice was even, but every so often it caught, not on grief exactly, but on the weight of carrying too much for too long. When I played the recording later in my car, something unexpected happened. Halfway through, I heard my own breathing change. I realized I'd been holding my breath while she spoke, as if I were afraid to let her pain spill into the air. And then it hit me. I wasn't just hearing Ruth's story, I was hearing my own, in a different uniform, a different war. Years of holding myself together for the sake of a role, a mission, an image, while quietly unraveling inside. I sat there in the driver's seat long after the recording ended, snow melting on the windshield, thinking, maybe we collect other people's truths because we're afraid to face our own.
That night, I checked into a small roadside inn outside Harrisburg. The walls were thin enough that I could hear the muffled television from the next room, but the quiet in my own space felt heavier than usual. I sat on the edge of the bed with the recorder in my hand, turning it over like it was something fragile. Up until then, I'd been comfortable staying behind the curtain, letting other women's voices take the stage. But Ruth's story had pulled something loose. It made me realize I'd been hiding, not just from the world, but from myself. I pressed the record button and for the first time, aimed it at me. I started with my name,
my real name. I spoke it into the emptiness of the room, and it sounded strange, like a word I hadn't used in years. Then I began to talk about enlisting in the Air Force at 22, the pride of my first solo flight, the smell of jet fuel, and the hum in my bones after landing. I talked about the years that followed, the transfers, the medals, the friends I made and lost. I talked about the nights alone in base housing, the times I drank too much just to quiet the noise in my head, the way my phone never rang unless it was about work. And then I spoke about the day I retired, how everyone clapped, shook my hand, thanked me for my service, and how I drove home, sat in my kitchen, and felt nothing. No joy, no grief, just an empty space where my life should have been. When I stopped recording, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the heater. I didn't play it back. I didn't need to. I wrote in my notebook, telling your own story feels like stepping into daylight after years in the hangar.
The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The sky outside the motel window was still a deep blue, with just a faint line of gold on the horizon. I poured myself a cup of weak motel coffee and sat at the small desk, my recorder and notebook in front of me. For a while, I just listened to the hum of the heater, the occasional car passing on the highway, my own breathing. Then I pressed record again. This time, I didn't start with my name. I started with the thought. Our stories are like flight paths. They cross, they drift apart, but they're all written in the same sky. I spoke about the women I'd met these past weeks. The baker in Louisiana, the van traveler on the Blue Ridge, the quilters in West Virginia, Ruth with her knitting and quiet strength. I spoke about how each of them had given me a piece of myself back without even knowing it. And then I wove in my own story, not as something separate, but as another thread in the same cloth. The long years in uniform, the pride, the loneliness, the silence after the service was done, the way I had mistaken being strong for never asking for help. When I stopped, the sun had broken over the horizon, flooding the room with light. I realized that whatever I made from these voices, whether it was a book, a collection of recordings, or just memories passed over coffee, it wouldn't be mine alone. It would belong to every woman who ever looked in the mirror and wondered where she'd gone. I packed my bag, slipped the recorder into the side pocket, and stepped outside. The air was cold, but it felt clean in my lungs. I didn't know exactly where I was headed next, only that there were more voices out there waiting to be found. Before getting into the car, I looked at the open road and thought, the mission isn't over. It's just changed shape. Then I started the engine and drove toward the light.